A former Navy SEAL walked into a small mountain clinic carrying an empty pet carrier, while his German Shepherd puppy marched beside him like a tiny king. The checkup should have taken 10 minutes, but when the vet reached for the puppy's belly, Cooper gently blocked her hand, again and again. Then came the dramatic yawn, the stolen stethoscope, and the strange crinkle hidden beneath him. Everyone thought he was just being funny, until they discovered what the little dog had been protecting all along. Before we begin, tell us what city you're watching from, and if this little puppy made you smile, please subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming animal stories. Rain whispered over Boone, North Carolina, turning the pine-lined street silver, while the small windows of Blue Ridge Animal Clinic glowed warm against the gray morning. Mark Bennett stepped out of his truck with a black pet carrier in one hand and absolutely no puppy inside it. At 42, Mark was the kind of man strangers noticed before they knew why. Tall, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, with a square jaw, short dark brown hair, calm blue-gray eyes, and the quiet posture of someone who had spent years learning not to waste motion. He had served as a Navy SEAL long enough to trust discipline, preparation, and clear plans. None of those things had helped him get Cooper into the carrier. Cooper, a 10-week-old German Shepherd puppy with soft black and tan fur, oversized paws, round brown eyes, and one ear standing proudly while the other folded sideways like it had missed the morning briefing, trotted beside him with his head high, his little tail lifted in triumph. His chest puffed out. He looked less like a puppy arriving for a routine checkup and more like a tiny K-9 commander inspecting a captured building. Mark glanced down at him. "You realize that carrier was for you, right?" Cooper blinked once, slow and innocent, then kept walking as if the matter had already been ruled on by a higher court. The trouble had started at home. Mark had placed Cooper gently into the carrier. Cooper had stepped out. Mark had tried again. Cooper had sat down in the kitchen, planted his fat little paws, and stared at him with the solemn courage of a patriot resisting tyranny. The third attempt ended with Cooper dragging one of Mark's socks into the hallway and lying on it like a dragon guarding gold. So Mark, a man who had once crossed dark water in silence with 80 pounds of gear on his back, had lost a tactical engagement to 12 pounds of fur and attitude. Now he entered the clinic carrying an empty carrier, while Cooper marched in beside him like a small king arriving without servants because servants slowed him down. The bell above the door chimed. A few people in the waiting room looked up. An elderly man holding a tabby cat raised his eyebrows. A woman with a sleepy beagle smiled into her coffee. Cooper did not bark, tremble, or pull at the leash. He simply surveyed the room, chose a padded bench near the wall, hopped onto it with an awkward scramble that almost ruined his dignity, spun once, then sat upright with his front paws together. Mark felt a dangerous laugh rise in his chest and pushed it back down. He had promised himself he would not encourage this behavior. Unfortunately, Cooper looked magnificent. Behind the front desk stood Tammy Wilson, the clinic assistant, a cheerful woman in her mid-30s with warm brown skin, curly black hair tied in a loose bun, bright hazel eyes, and the kind of grin that made every room feel less nervous. Tammy glanced at the empty carrier, then at Cooper, sitting like royalty. "Morning, Mr. Bennett. I see the patient declined standard transportation." Mark set the carrier down with the quiet defeat of a man placing flowers on a battlefield. "He rejected it twice." "I'm appealing the decision." Tammy laughed, and Cooper lifted his chin, accepting the attention as if applause had been expected. A moment later, Dr. Susan Miller stepped out from the hallway with a clipboard tucked against her chest. Susan was in her early 50s, tall and lean, with fair skin, gentle green eyes, and shoulder-length chestnut hair streaked with silver near the temples. She had the calm hands of someone who had treated frightened animals for decades, and the sharp gaze of a woman who could tell the difference between fear, pain, and mischief before a creature made a sound. "Well," she said, looking at Cooper, "there's our little patient." Cooper looked at her, then looked away, pretending not to be impressed. Susan's mouth twitched. Routine checkup? Mark nodded. That was the plan. Inside, though, he felt the first small tug of suspicion. Cooper was too composed. At home, he had spent the morning trying to chew a shoelace, attack his reflection in the oven door, and steal a corner of Mark's toast. Now he sat perfectly still, too still, like a recruit hiding contraband during inspection. Susan came around the desk and bent gently toward him. "Come on, handsome. Let's get you to the exam room." The instant her hands moved closer, Cooper leaned down, took the strap of Mark's backpack carefully between his teeth, and pulled backward. Not hard. Not wild, just enough to delay the entire operation by 3 suspicious seconds. Mark lowered his eyes. Cooper looked up at him with angelic innocence. Then, from somewhere beneath the puppy's belly, came a tiny, unmistakable crinkle. Mark froze. The rain tapped softly against the windows. Tammy stopped smiling. Susan tilted her head. Cooper sat even straighter, as if dignity could bury evidence. Mark stared at the little dog and finally understood. Cooper was not afraid of the clinic. He was trying to smuggle a secret inside. The exam room smelled faintly of disinfectant, warm towels, and the kind of odor Cooper seemed personally offended by. Dr. Susan Miller led the way down the short hallway, her clipboard tucked under one arm, while Tammy Wilson followed with a small basket of puppy treats and the grin of a woman who already knew this appointment would not be normal. Mark Bennett walked behind them with Cooper at his side, the empty carrier swinging from one hand like evidence from a failed operation. Cooper's little paws clicked against the polished floor with absurd confidence, each step measured, each glance sharp, as if the 10-week-old German Shepherd had been assigned to inspect the medical facility and report any weaknesses to higher command. Mark watched him carefully. That tiny crinkle under Cooper's belly had not left his mind. It had been soft, almost nothing, the kind of sound a man might miss if he had not spent years training himself to notice what did not belong, but Mark had heard it. He knew the difference between fear and delay. Cooper was not scared. Cooper was stalling, and, somehow, that made Mark more suspicious than if the puppy had started barking at the door. "All right, little man," Susan said as they entered the exam room, her voice gentle but practiced. The room was bright and clean, with pale cabinets, a stainless steel examination table, a wall-mounted scale, and a neat row of instruments arranged with almost military precision. Mark would have appreciated the organization more if his puppy had not been looking at it like a battlefield map. Susan patted the table. "Let's see what we're working with today." Mark bent down to pick Cooper up. Cooper immediately made himself heavier, which was impressive for a creature who weighed less than Mark's old rucksack. He spread his paws, lowered his shoulders, and gave Mark one long, solemn look that seemed to say this moment would be remembered in court. Mark narrowed his eyes. "Don't start." Cooper blinked. Tammy, leaning against the counter with the treat basket, whispered, "He heard you. He simply rejected your authority." Mark scooped Cooper up anyway, carefully supporting his chest and hindquarters, and placed him on the cool metal table. For one breath, Cooper stood perfectly still. Then, instead of trembling, whining, or trying to leap away like any ordinary puppy, he lowered himself onto the stainless steel and stretched out as if he had discovered the finest bed in all of North Carolina. His front legs slid forward, his back legs tucked under him. His chin settled with royal satisfaction on the table's edge. One ear stood proudly, the other flopped sideways in open rebellion. Then he opened his mouth and yawned. It was not a small puppy yawn. It was not even the innocent little yawn of a tired animal. It was enormous, theatrical, slow enough to deserve applause, wide enough to show every tiny white tooth he owned. His pink tongue curled like a ribbon, his eyes squeezed shut, and his whole body shivered with the drama of it, as though the exam room lights had dimmed, the curtain had risen, and Cooper Bennett had taken center stage. Tammy slapped a hand over her mouth. Susan lifted one eyebrow. Mark stared at the puppy, unimpressed in theory and deeply entertained in secret. "He's trying to take command of the room," Mark muttered. Cooper finished the yawn, closed his mouth and rested his chin again with the smug calm of a performer who knew the audience had been conquered. Susan let out a soft laugh and set her clipboard down. "Well, if His Majesty is ready, we'll begin." Cooper's eyes opened halfway. He looked at her with the patience of a king tolerating paperwork. Susan started with the safe things. She checked his ears first, lifting the floppy one gently, then the upright one, shining a small light inside. Cooper allowed it with surprising dignity. He did not pull away, he did not growl. He only looked at Mark once as if making sure there would be witnesses to his cooperation. "Ears look good," Susan said. "Clean, no irritation." Tammy marked something on the chart. A rare moment of compliance. Mark folded his arms. "Don't praise him too soon." Cooper flicked his eyes toward him, offended but silent. Next came the mouth. Susan placed a finger near Cooper's lip, and the puppy opened just enough to reveal tiny teeth and a tongue that immediately tried to lick her glove. "Teeth look good," Susan said, amused. "Very good, actually." Cooper, perhaps encouraged by the word good, lifted his chin a little higher. Mark could almost see the pride blooming in him. It was ridiculous. It was also dangerously charming. Then Susan moved to the front legs. "Let me see these big paws." Cooper extended one paw before she even touched it, as if presenting a formal document. Tammy made a small sound of delight. "Oh, look at that! A gentleman." Mark looked at the paw, then at the puppy. "That gentleman ate part of my shoelace before breakfast." Cooper ignored the accusation. Susan checked the first paw, then the second. Pads healthy, nails fine, joints normal. Cooper remained still, almost too still, offering each limb with the polished manners of a tiny patient determined to appear innocent in front of a jury. Mark's suspicion sharpened. This was not cooperation. This was camouflage. Cooper was giving them the easy territory so they would stop before reaching the dangerous one. Susan seemed to notice it too. Her movements slowed, her green eyes studying the puppy's posture. Cooper's belly was pressed firmly to the table, not relaxed, planted, protected. When Susan's hand drifted from Cooper's chest toward his stomach, the change was instant. Cooper's eyes snapped fully open. His little paw lifted and came down gently on Susan's wrist. There was no bite, no snarl, no panic. Just one soft, black and tan paw resting against her hand with clear, polite refusal. Susan paused. Tammy's mouth fell open before she laughed. "I believe the patient has issued a formal ban on the belly region." Mark leaned slightly closer. Cooper did not look at him. That, too, was suspicious. "Cooper," Mark said quietly, "move your paw." Cooper held still. The paw remained on Susan's wrist, light as a feather, firm as a locked gate. Susan's expression shifted from amusement to professional curiosity. "Interesting." She withdrew her hand and tried again from a slightly different angle. Cooper's other paw rose this time and landed on top of her fingers. Same pressure, same silence, same absolute refusal. Tammy crossed her arms, grinning. "That is the most respectful disobedience I've ever seen." Mark felt his mouth twitch, but he kept his voice steady. He knows exactly what he's doing. And that was the problem. Cooper had always been clever in the chaotic way puppies were clever. He could find a dropped crumb from 2 rooms away. He could locate a missing sock with the instincts of a bloodhound and the ethics of a pirate. But this was different. This was focused. This was tactical. Mark had spent enough of his life around plans, decoys, and hidden motives to recognize a defensive position when he saw one. A 10-week-old puppy had established a perimeter around his belly. Susan straightened slowly, studying Cooper as though the tiny dog had just become a puzzle. "Mark," she asked, "are you sure he didn't bring anything in with him?" Mark looked at the empty carrier on the floor. He looked at Cooper's too calm face, the proud little chest, the belly sealed tight to the table. "I'm becoming less sure by the second." Tammy held up a treat. "Maybe we negotiate?" Cooper glanced at the treat. For one dangerous moment his nose trembled. His eyes softened. His soul seemed to lean toward betrayal. Then he remembered his mission and lowered his chin again, pressing his belly even more firmly to the metal. Mark exhaled through his nose. "All right," he said, in the same calm tone he had once used before stepping into cold surf under a moonless sky. "Operation Belly Check begins now." The word belly changed everything. Cooper's head turned sharply. His eyes locked on Mark with wounded disbelief, as if Mark had just announced a classified mission over a loudspeaker. Susan's lips parted in a smile she tried to hide. Tammy whispered, "Oh, he knows." Mark nodded slowly. "Yes, he does." For a moment, the exam room went still except for the soft rain tapping against the window and the faint hum of the overhead lights. Susan rested one hand on the edge of the table and looked from Mark to the puppy. "So," she said carefully, "you're telling me you have no idea what might be under him?" Mark stared at Cooper. Cooper, with the dignity of a saint and the guilt of a thief, slowly lifted his gaze toward the ceiling. He did not bark. He did not whine. He did not move 1 inch. And somehow that silence accused him more loudly than any confession ever could. Cooper did not look at the ceiling for long. He was too smart for that, and Mark Bennett knew it. The little German shepherd lowered his eyes again, slowly, carefully, with the solemn expression of a creature who had been accused without evidence and fully intended to exploit that technicality. The exam room stayed bright and quiet around him, rain ticking softly against the window while the overhead lights shone on the stainless steel table like moonlight on a battlefield. Dr. Susan Miller stood beside him, one gloved hand resting near the edge of the table, her gentle green eyes narrowed with the kind of patient focus that came from years of treating animals who could not explain themselves. Tammy Wilson remained near the counter with the treat basket pressed against her hip, smiling so hard she looked 1 second away from losing professional control. Mark stood across from Susan, arms folded, his broad shoulders still, his face calm, but inside, amusement and suspicion were beginning to wrestle like 2 old dogs over the same bone. He had seen Cooper chew shoelaces, steal socks, bark at a leaf, and fall backward while trying to sit like a grown police dog. But this was not ordinary puppy chaos. This was deliberate. This was strategy wrapped in fur. Susan tried first from Cooper's left side, slow and careful. "All right, sweetheart," she murmured. "Nobody is accusing anybody of smuggling anything. We're just checking." Cooper watched her hand approach. His brown eyes widened, not with fear, but with calculation. The moment Susan's fingers drifted toward his lower ribs, Cooper shifted left, rolling his little body just enough to keep his belly sealed against the table. Susan paused. Mark's eyebrow rose. Tammy whispered, "Countermove." Susan tried from the right. Cooper responded instantly, rolling right with the grace of a creature much older, wiser, and far more suspicious than 10 weeks should allow. His floppy ear folded completely over one eye, but he did not fix it. Dignity, apparently, was less important than defense. "Interesting," Susan said, though her voice carried a laugh she was trying not to release. "Very interesting." Mark leaned closer. "Cooper." The puppy looked at him with wounded innocence. Mark felt that look hit him right in the chest, which was inconvenient, because he was trying to remain the adult in the room. "Don't do that." Cooper blinked. Tammy lifted one treat between 2 fingers. It was a small, soft training bite shaped like a tiny bone, and the smell reached Cooper like a trumpet from heaven. His nose twitched. His eyes snapped to it. His whole body betrayed him in stages. First the nostrils, then the whiskers, then the tiny pink tongue that appeared for half a second at the edge of his mouth. Tammy moved the treat a little closer. "Would Your Majesty care to cooperate with the medical staff?" Cooper's head followed the treat. His belly almost lifted. Almost. For one glorious moment, Mark thought the mission had cracked. Then, Cooper remembered whatever sacred object he was guarding beneath him and collapsed flat again, chin down, paws wide, belly pressed to the metal as if gravity itself had sworn loyalty to him. Tammy stared at him. He chose principles over snacks. Mark shook his head. That's new. Cooper gave one soft huff as though offended by the doubt. Susan changed tactics. Fine, we'll let the belly wait. Give me a paw. Cooper immediately lifted his right front paw, not hesitantly, not accidentally. He raised it with perfect timing, like a gentleman offering a handshake at a formal dinner. Susan took it carefully, checked the pads, the nails, the little joints. Everything was healthy. Cooper sat still, eyes half closed, looking almost noble. "Good paw," Susan said. Cooper lowered it, then promptly lifted the other paw before anyone asked. Tammy made a sound that was half laugh, half gasp. "He's presenting evidence of innocence." Mark watched, unmoved on the outside and dangerously entertained on the inside. "He's redirecting the inspection." Susan checked the second paw. It, too, was perfect. Cooper looked pleased with himself, but not relaxed. His belly still never left the table. Then he escalated. He rolled slightly onto his side, but only the upper half of his body, creating the illusion of cooperation while keeping his lower body angled protectively. He tilted his head back, exposed his throat, and gave Susan the saddest, softest, most theatrical look any puppy had ever produced under fluorescent lighting. The upright ear drooped a fraction. The floppy ear fell lower. His eyes shone like polished chestnuts left out in the rain. Tammy pressed a hand to her heart. "Oh no, he's doing daytime drama. Daytime." Susan laughed under her breath. "That is not going to work." It was, in fact, working on Mark. He could feel his resolve weakening, which was absurd. He had endured instructors screaming inches from his face without blinking. He had remained calm during training exercises designed to turn the mind into thunder. Yet one German Shepherd puppy with a half-folded ear and a tragic chin angle was making him reconsider the entire concept of consequences. Cooper noticed. Of course he noticed. His eyes shifted to Mark, and then he reached both front paws toward him, not fast, not frantic, softly, pleadingly. Mark made the mistake of extending one hand. Cooper placed both paws on top of it and held on, warm pads pressing against Mark's knuckles, tiny claws barely touching his skin. Then Cooper looked up. Mark felt something inside him give way by half an inch. "Don't start negotiating with me," he said quietly. Cooper responded by giving his hand one long, careful lick. Tammy leaned toward Susan and whispered, "He's bribing him with affection." Susan nodded, still studying the puppy's body, and doing a very good job. Mark gently pulled his hand back before Cooper could win a full diplomatic victory. "Listen, recruit," he said, lowering his voice into the calm tone that usually worked when Cooper tried to steal laundry. "Nobody is confiscating national property. Nobody is raiding your treasure vault. Dr. Miller just needs to make sure you're safe." Cooper's ears shifted at the word treasure. It was tiny, almost invisible, but Susan caught it. Mark caught Susan catching it. Tammy caught both of them catching it and looked delighted. "Aha," Tammy whispered. Cooper went very still. Susan's expression grew more serious, though her voice remained kind. "Mark, I need to know what's under him if there's anything under him. If it's plastic, string, something sharp, or something he might chew through, it could be a problem." The humor in Mark's chest softened into concern. He looked at Cooper's small body, the determined line of his back, the stubborn press of his belly against the cold table. Cooper was silly, yes. Dramatic, absolutely. But he was also a baby, still learning what belonged to him and what the world might take away. Mark remembered the first day he had brought him home from the rescue center. Cooper had carried a torn rope toy from room to room and slept with one paw on it, as if ownership had to be proven through constant contact. That memory made Mark's voice gentler. "Cooper," he said, bending closer until the puppy could see his face clearly. "We just need to check, that's all." Cooper stared at him. The room seemed to shrink around those little brown eyes. For a heartbeat, the puppy almost softened. His shoulders loosened. His paws drew in. Susan moved one careful inch closer. Cooper noticed immediately and placed his paw over Mark's hand again, not blocking Susan this time, but holding Mark like a witness, like an attorney, like the only man in the room who might understand the seriousness of stolen treasure. Then he licked Mark's fingers again, slower this time, his eyes never leaving him. It was not surrender. It was not apology. It was bargaining. Tammy watched the whole exchange, her smile turning tender around the edges. "Oh, he's good," she whispered. Mark looked at her. "He's 10 weeks old, and already better at negotiation than most adults." Susan sighed softly, amused but alert. Cooper lowered his chin to Mark's hand, still keeping his belly protected, still guarding whatever secret lay beneath him. The little dog looked peaceful again, but every inch of him remained on duty. Tammy tilted her head, studying the puppy with mock seriousness, and delivered the verdict that hung in the room like the opening line of a much larger battle. "He's not giving up," she said. "He's negotiating." Susan decided, with the calm optimism of a woman who had survived cats in ceiling vents and parrots with personal grudges, that perhaps the belly could wait. Cooper remained pressed to the stainless steel table like a tiny black and tan sandbag, his front paws folded over Mark's hand, his round brown eyes still shining with that dangerous mixture of innocence and strategy. The rain continued tapping softly against the window, but inside the exam room, everything had taken on the tense stillness of a standoff no one had expected before breakfast. Tammy stood near the counter, her treat basket lowered now, watching Cooper as if he were not a puppy but a small general who had just refused peace terms. Mark Bennett kept his face steady, though inside he was beginning to feel the strange humiliation of a man who had once trusted maps, timing, and discipline, only to be outmaneuvered by a creature whose left ear still had not decided whether it belonged upright or sideways. Susan reached for the stethoscope around her neck. "All right," she said gently. "Let's listen to his heart first. Maybe once he realizes nothing terrible is happening, he'll relax." Cooper's ears twitched at the soft metallic sound. His eyes moved from Susan's face to the stethoscope, and something changed in him instantly. His pupils sharpened, his nose stopped twitching, his whole body went still, not with fear, but with professional suspicion. Mark saw it and nearly warned Susan, but Susan had already lifted the chest piece toward Cooper's small ribs. Before the cool metal came anywhere close, Cooper darted forward and took the rubber tube gently between his teeth. Not hard enough to damage it, not wild enough to be called biting, just firm enough to stop the entire medical procedure and claim possession of the equipment. Tammy burst out laughing. "Oh, no! He confiscated it." Susan froze with her hand still extended. "Cooper." The puppy stared at her around the tube with solemn authority, as if he had discovered illegal contraband on her person. Mark lowered his chin and looked directly at the dog. "Private Cooper," he said in a low, serious voice. "Stealing medical equipment is not part of any training manual I know." Cooper gave one tiny tug on the stethoscope, not aggressive, almost polite, as though correcting Mark's misunderstanding. Tammy leaned against the counter, wiping at one eye. "He's not stealing. He's conducting an investigation." Susan tried not to laugh as she gently freed the tube from Cooper's mouth. "Thank you, Officer Cooper. I'll take that back." Cooper released it reluctantly, then immediately placed one paw over the tubing when Susan rested it on the table. Mark exhaled through his nose. He wanted to be stern. He truly did. But there was something impossible about this little dog's confidence, something so absurdly brave and misguided that it tugged laughter out of the corners of the room like sunlight sneaking through storm clouds. Susan moved the stethoscope farther away and tried to approach from a different angle. Cooper, however, had already moved to phase 2. Slowly, so slowly that the motion seemed almost imaginary at first, he began to slide toward the far edge of the exam table. 1 inch. Pause. Another inch. Pause. His belly never lifted. His paws dragged softly over the metal. His eyes stayed locked on Susan, wide and serious, as if he believed that if he moved with enough dignity, nobody would notice his escape. Tammy whispered. "Is he crawling away?" Mark watched Cooper's hind paws inch backward. "He thinks stealth is working." Susan crossed her arms. "It is not." Cooper continued. Another inch. His little tail remained perfectly still, betraying nothing. Mark stepped around the table and blocked the edge with one broad hand. Cooper stopped so suddenly his floppy ear bounced. For 2 full seconds, dog and man stared at each other. Mark's expression said, "Don't even think about it." Cooper's expression said, "I have already thought about it extensively." Then the puppy gave a long, weary sigh, deep from his tiny chest, heavy with the sorrow of an old farmer who had just found someone sitting in his favorite chair. Tammy nearly folded in half, laughing. That sigh had taxes in it. Susan pressed her lips together. Even Mark had to look away for a moment. Cooper took advantage of that single weakness and shifted backward again, sealing his belly tighter against the table. The humor was bright, but beneath it Mark felt the concern return, quiet as a shadow. Cooper was not simply being ridiculous. He was guarding something with the stubborn devotion of a creature who believed losing it would change the world. Susan seemed to feel the same shift. Her smile softened. She placed the stethoscope aside completely and approached with empty hands. "No tools," she said gently. "See? Just me." Cooper watched her. His breathing slowed, but his shoulders stayed tense. Susan moved closer to his side, careful and unhurried. Mark kept one hand near Cooper's chest, not holding him down, only reminding him that someone familiar was there. "Easy," Mark murmured. "Nobody's raiding the vault." Cooper looked at him quickly, and that look pierced through the comedy of the morning. There was fear there now, small but real. Not fear of pain, not fear of Susan. Fear of losing whatever secret pressed beneath his soft puppy belly. Susan's hand drifted toward the guarded place again. Cooper did not swat this time. He did not snatch the stethoscope or offer a paw or attempt another slow-motion escape. Instead, he leaned forward and pressed his head into Mark's hand. His little body trembled once. Then he made a low, broken sound. Not quite a whine, not quite a groan, a soft plea that seemed far too old for such a young dog. The laughter in the room faded. Tammy's smile lowered into something tender. Susan stopped moving. Mark felt Cooper's warm forehead against his palm, and for a moment all his dry humor drained away. He remembered Cooper's first night at home, the puppy carrying a torn rope toy from room to room, refusing to sleep unless one paw touched it. Mark had thought it was cute then. Now he understood more clearly. Cooper had not been dramatic because he was spoiled. He had been guarding what little the world had finally allowed him to call his own. "Hey," Mark said softly, bending closer. "Nobody's taking it from you just to be cruel." Cooper's eyes lifted. One ear stood, the other drooped, and his face looked so wounded that Mark almost forgot the entire purpose of the exam. Almost. Susan's voice stayed low. "If he has something under there, I do need to see it." Plastic, string, anything small. He could chew it, swallow it, or hurt himself. Mark nodded. Duty returned, gentle but firm. Love did not mean letting Cooper win every battle. Sometimes love meant checking the thing he was desperate to hide. "Cooper," Mark whispered, "we just need to know it's safe." Cooper's answer was to place his chin more heavily into Mark's palm and make another tiny, pleading sound. Tammy swallowed, then tried to rescue the room with humor, though her voice was softer now. "He is absolutely asking for legal representation." Susan edged closer, only an inch. Cooper shifted. Mark felt it before he saw it, the sudden tightening of muscle under the fur, the quick calculation returning behind those brown eyes. The puppy twisted to cover the guarded spot, but this time emotion made him sloppy. His back half moved too fast. His front paws slid. His belly lifted for less than a second, barely enough time for anyone to breathe. But it was enough. A small corner of blue plastic peeked out from beneath him, crinkled and bright against the silver table. The room went silent. Susan's eyes dropped to it. Tammy's mouth opened. Mark stared. Cooper froze. For one suspended heartbeat, no one moved. Then Cooper slammed himself flat again, covering the plastic completely, his eyes huge and horrified. He looked at Mark. Mark looked at Susan. Susan looked at the spot beneath Cooper's belly. And Cooper, poor guilty little king of the exam table, knew they had seen. For one breath, nobody moved. The small blue corner of plastic had vanished beneath Cooper again, but the room had already changed. Secrets, Mark Bennett knew, had a strange way of becoming louder once they were almost exposed. Cooper lay flat on the stainless steel table, his belly pressed down with desperate commitment, his brown eyes wide, his oversized paws spread like sandbags around a tiny fortress. One ear stood straight up, the other flopped sideways, and somehow that made him look even guiltier. Dr. Susan Miller stood beside the table, one hand hovering in the air, her calm face caught between professional concern and barely contained amusement. Tammy Wilson had frozen near the counter with her mouth open, the treat basket hanging from one hand as if she had forgotten gravity existed. Mark stared at the spot beneath Cooper's belly. He did not know what the puppy had hidden, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Cooper knew they knew. And Cooper, being Cooper, decided the only reasonable response was emotional warfare. Before Susan could move, the puppy sprang toward Mark, not off the table, not into danger, but forward into Mark's chest with all the urgency of a tiny soldier seeking emergency evacuation. Mark caught him instinctively, one broad hand bracing the puppy's back while the other steadied his chest. Cooper immediately began licking his wrist, then his sleeve, then the back of his hand in long, dramatic strokes, each one wetter and more desperate than the last. "Cooper," Mark said, trying to sound stern and failing by at least half a mile. "That is not a legal defense." Cooper licked harder. Tammy recovered enough to point at him. "Affection warfare," she declared. "He's launching affection warfare." Susan pressed her lips together, but her eyes were smiling. "It's an advanced tactic." Cooper, perhaps encouraged by Tammy's diagnosis, shifted targets. He leaned toward Mark's shoulder, licked the seam of his jacket, then stretched his neck toward Tammy as if distributing bribes equally among witnesses. Tammy tried to step back, but Cooper's tongue caught the corner of her name badge with one quick swipe. She looked down in disbelief. "Did he just lick my badge?" Mark glanced at her. "You've been compromised." Cooper then turned his round, shining eyes toward Susan, tail twitching in short, nervous beats. He did not bark. He did not whine. He simply looked at her with the full force of puppy tragedy, as if asking whether a small dog could not make one private financial decision without the entire clinic forming a committee. Susan softened, but she did not step away. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "whatever is under you, we still have to see it." Cooper's ears dropped. His body slid back down, slowly, dramatically, until his belly sealed over the hidden object again. The performance was impressive. Mark had seen men bluff under pressure, but none with eyes this wet or paws this round. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Listen, Private Cooper, nobody is taking your classified materials without review, but if you brought something dangerous in here, we need to know." Cooper stared at him. For a second, Mark saw something beneath the comedy. Worry, possessiveness, and the small, fierce fear of a puppy who had not yet learned that home meant things could remain his tomorrow. Susan seemed to see it too. She did not rush. Instead, she rested one gloved hand lightly on Cooper's shoulder and waited. Cooper trembled once, more from tension than fear. Tammy set the treat basket down very quietly. The room, which had been full of laughter only moments before, grew soft around them. Susan waited for Cooper to shift, not forcing him, not pinning him, simply giving him the chance to make one small mistake. The mistake came when Cooper glanced at Mark. It was only a flicker, an embarrassed look, a plea, a tiny break in concentration, but it was enough. His front half moved toward Mark's hand, his back half loosened, and the blue plastic slipped free by another inch. Susan moved with gentle precision. 2 fingers caught the edge of the bag and eased it out from beneath Cooper's belly. Cooper gasped. It was not a real gasp, of course, but the sound he made was close enough, a tiny, scandalized huff from a dog whose empire had just been invaded. Mark held him steady while Susan lifted the object into the light. It was a small, crinkled bag, blue and silver, with the top twisted shut and little tooth marks along one corner. Tammy leaned in. "Is that—" Susan turned it over. Mark read the label and closed his eyes for 1 second. "Turkey training treats." Tammy slapped a hand over her mouth. He smuggled snacks into his own checkup. Cooper gave a low, offended grumble, as if the word smuggled was unfairly prejudicial. Mark opened his eyes and looked down at him. "Cooper." The puppy looked away. Susan, however, frowned slightly. "This feels heavier than an empty treat bag." Cooper froze. His tail stopped. His ears sank another inch. Mark noticed immediately. "There's more." Susan carefully opened the bag. The first thing she pulled out was indeed a small handful of turkey puppy treats, slightly crushed but still fragrant enough to make Cooper's nose twitch with longing. "That part makes sense," Tammy said. Susan reached in again and drew out a dark gray sock, rolled into a suspiciously tight ball. Mark stared. "That's mine." Tammy grinned. "Was yours." Cooper glanced at the sock with the wounded pride of an artist seeing his masterpiece misunderstood. Susan placed it on the tray and reached back into the bag. Next came a short piece of brown shoelace, chewed at one end. Mark's jaw tightened. "I wondered where that went." Cooper avoided eye contact. Then came a blue pen cap. Tammy blinked. "That might be from the front desk." Susan pulled out a tiny yellow rubber duck from the clinic waiting room toy basket, its painted eyes scratched and its squeaker dented. Tammy gasped. "Mr. Quackers has been missing since Tuesday." Mark looked at Cooper. Cooper looked at the wall. Susan was not finished. She reached in again and drew out a soft strip of faded plaid fabric. Mark recognized it instantly. A piece from the corner of Cooper's blanket at home, the same blanket the puppy dragged from room to room whenever the house felt too quiet. For the first time, Mark's amusement softened into something warmer. Cooper had not only stolen things because he wanted snacks, he had packed comfort, ownership, proof of himself. Then Susan's fingers touched something flat and plastic. She pulled out a temporary clinic name tag, the kind used for visiting students and volunteers. Tammy's eyes went huge. "No way! That disappeared last week." Susan stared at it, then slowly looked at Cooper. Mark looked at Cooper, too. Cooper looked at the little pile of evidence on the metal tray. Treats, sock, shoelace, pen cap, rubber duck, blanket scrap, name tag. It was not a random mess. It was a kingdom. A strange, stolen, puppy-sized kingdom. For a moment, Cooper seemed to forget how to breathe. His ears folded back. His round eyes moved from one treasure to another, watching each item sit exposed under the lights, no longer secret, no longer protected by the warm shield of his belly. Tammy whispered, "He had a whole collection." Susan's expression held both concern and amazement. Mark drew in a slow breath. He wanted to laugh. He almost did. But Cooper's face stopped him. The little dog looked like a monarch watching his castle gates fall. So Mark made his voice serious but not angry. "Cooper," he said, "this is not collecting. This is evidence." Tammy made a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been a squeak. Susan covered her smile with the back of her wrist. Cooper did not appreciate the courtroom tone. He turned his head away, chin lifting in wounded dignity. Then, slowly, the dignity cracked. His ears drooped lower. His shoulders rounded. His little tail tucked close to his side. He shifted toward the far end of the table and faced the wall, refusing to look at Mark, Susan, Tammy, or the fallen kingdom in the tray. The room went quiet again. But this quiet was different. Not mysterious, not tense, softer. Mark watched Cooper curl into himself, and the humor inside him settled into tenderness. Since walking into the clinic, Cooper had been a king, a soldier, a thief, a negotiator, and a master of tactical affection. Now, for the first time, he was only a puppy who had been caught hiding the things he loved. Cooper let out one tiny sigh, heavy with shame, and kept his face turned to the wall. Cooper did not turn around. The little German shepherd sat at the far end of the stainless steel table with his back to everyone, his round shoulders folded inward, his chin tucked low, and his oversized paws gathered beneath him as if he were trying to shrink into a much smaller dog. The evidence tray sat behind him, full of ruined glory. Turkey treats, Mark's gray sock, the chewed shoelace, the blue pen cap, the yellow rubber duck, the torn strip from his blanket, and the temporary clinic name tag that had apparently lived a secret life beneath Cooper's belly. Only minutes earlier, Cooper had been a king, a negotiator, a master of affection warfare. Now he looked like a tiny knight after the castle gates had opened and every stolen spoon in the kingdom had been counted in public. Mark Bennett stood beside the table, the laughter still lingering somewhere in his chest, but it no longer felt right to let it out. He had expected mischief. He had not expected shame. That was the thing about animals, Mark thought. People often notice the funny part first. The sock in the mouth, the guilty eyes, the dramatic sigh. But beneath all that comedy there was sometimes a softer truth, a little trembling place where fear and love slept side by side. Cooper was not looking at the tray. He was not looking at Susan. He was certainly not looking at Mark. His one upright ear had lowered halfway, and the floppy ear hung like a flag after a storm. Tammy Wilson, who had laughed through nearly the whole battle, grew quiet near the counter. Her bright face softened, and she set the treat basket down with unusual care, as if even the sound of plastic touching the counter might make the puppy feel worse. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered. "He really thinks he's in trouble." Dr. Susan Miller removed her gloves slowly and dropped them into the bin, her expression turning from amused detective to gentle veterinarian. She had seen this before, though never with quite so much theatrical licking and evidence recovery. "Not trouble," she said softly, more like embarrassed and maybe worried. Mark looked at her. Susan leaned against the edge of the cabinet, her green eyes on Cooper, her voice calm enough to smooth the corners off the room. Puppies who've recently changed homes sometimes hold on to objects, food, toys, cloth, anything with familiar smell. It isn't always bad behavior. Sometimes it's just their way of saying, "This is mine. Please don't let the world take it." Cooper's shoulders rose, barely. He had heard her. Mark knew he had heard her. The puppy was young, but he had already learned certain words, tones, silences. He knew when humans laughed. He knew when they scolded. And somehow, in that strange little heart beneath all the soft black and tan fur, he seemed to know when the air carried disappointment. Mark drew in a slow breath. He did not want this to become heavy. That was not what this morning was. No thunderstorm of sorrow. No ancient wound opening beneath fluorescent lights. Just a rescued puppy with a ridiculous treasure bag and a former Navy SEAL who had lost several rounds of negotiation to a creature who could still trip over his own paws. But warmth rose in Mark all the same, quiet and protective. He remembered bringing Cooper home from the small rescue center a few weeks earlier. Cooper had not been broken. He had not been a tragic little ghost. He had been healthy, curious, loud, and determined to chew every available corner of civilization. But at the rescue, he had slept in a room where many puppies shared space, bowls, blankets, and toys. Nothing belonged to one mouth for long. A rope toy became a group treaty. A blanket became neutral territory. A treat vanished if you blinked. Maybe now, inside Mark's quiet house, Cooper was still learning that tomorrow would not come and steal everything back. Mark moved closer to the table and lowered himself until his face was near Cooper's level. "Hey," he said. Cooper did not turn. Mark waited. He had learned patience in harder places, but somehow this required a different kind. Not the patience of silence in dark water, not the patience of watching a ridgeline for movement. This was the patience of telling a guilty puppy, without words he fully understood, that love did not expire because of a sock. "Cooper," Mark said again, softer, "you're not bad." Cooper's tail gave one weak thump against the metal table, then stopped. Tammy pressed both hands over her heart. That tail thump was an apology and a legal appeal. Susan smiled faintly, then picked up the metal tray. "Let's make this easier." She carried the tray around the table and placed it in front of Cooper, not too close, not like a trap, just close enough for him to see. The puppy's nose twitched before he could stop it. He glanced down very quickly at the pile of treasures. His eyes moved first to the turkey treats, then to the piece of blanket, then to Mark's sock. His ears shifted. Susan crouched slightly. "See? Nobody threw them away. Nobody's angry. We only needed to make sure none of this could hurt you." Cooper stared at the tray as if it had returned from war. Mark reached in, took the sock, looked at the holes in it, and sighed. "This one may never walk again." Tammy's laugh slipped out, small and gentle. Even Susan chuckled. Cooper looked sideways, cautious, as if testing whether laughter meant danger. Mark placed the sock back in the tray. "But it's yours for now. Evidence logged and returned." Cooper blinked. His body loosened a fraction. Mark touched the torn blanket strip with one finger. "This too, though I'm pretty sure this used to be part of an actual blanket." Cooper's eyes softened at that one. Mark saw it. So did Susan. She gave Mark a small nod, the kind that said, "There it is." Mark rested his hand flat on the table, palm down, not touching Cooper yet. "No one is taking your whole world away," he said quietly. "But next time, the treasure gets declared at the door." Tammy nodded with mock seriousness. "Customs inspection. Very official." Cooper looked at her, then at Mark, then back at the tray. The shame had not disappeared, but it was beginning to thaw, like frost under morning sun, slow and reluctant. Susan took up the stethoscope again, but this time she kept it low, letting Cooper see every movement. "We still need to finish the exam, buddy. No tricks now, just health." Cooper's ears dipped at the sight of the stethoscope, but he did not grab it. Mark stayed close, his hand near Cooper's shoulder. "Easy, Private Cooper. Stand down." Cooper gave a tiny sigh. It sounded like defeat, but a dignified defeat, the sort sung about in old ballads if the hero happened to have 4 paws and a stolen rubber duck. Susan touched the chest piece to Cooper's side. He tensed, then relaxed. She listened to his heart. Strong. Fast with nerves, but steady. She listened to his lungs. Clear. She checked his belly carefully, and Cooper shut his eyes as if enduring great betrayal, but he did not block her. She felt along his ribs, his joints, his hips, his little paws again. Mark watched the whole time, feeling both proud and slightly ridiculous for being proud. Cooper was allowing the exam, not because he had been defeated, but because he was beginning to believe the room had not turned against him. Susan finally straightened and wrote a few notes on the chart. "He's healthy," she said. "Very healthy. Good heart, clear lungs, strong joints, good weight, good coat, belly feels normal. No pain, no swelling, no signs he swallowed anything he shouldn't." Mark's shoulders eased before he realized they had been tight. "Good." Tammy peered at Cooper, who still looked mournful despite the clean bill of health. "Any diagnosis for the wounded pride?" Susan capped her pen. Mild bruising to dignity, expected to recover with affection, supervision, and maybe fewer opportunities for theft. Tammy nodded gravely. Serious, but treatable. Mark looked down at Cooper. "You hear that? Your dignity survived." Cooper glanced up at him at last. It was not a full look, not the proud stare from the waiting room or the tactical glare from the belly battle. It was smaller, uncertain, and a little embarrassed. "Are we still us?" his eyes seemed to ask. Mark's chest tightened in a way he would have denied under oath. He reached out and scratched gently behind Cooper's uneven ears. "Yeah," he said. "We're still us." Cooper leaned into the touch for 1 second, then lowered his head again, overwhelmed by forgiveness, medical science, and public exposure. Susan placed the tray of treasures near him, and this time Cooper did not dive over it. He only sniffed the blanket strip, then the sock, then gave the rubber duck one faint nudge with his nose. The duck squeaked weakly. Tammy covered her mouth. Mark stared at the ceiling, fighting a smile. Cooper, hearing the squeak, looked faintly betrayed by his own kingdom. Then, slowly, he shifted toward the edge of the table where Mark stood. He did not leap. He did not lick. He did not launch another tactical campaign. He simply moved with quiet care, lowered one oversized front paw and placed it on the toe of Mark's boot. The paw was warm, soft, and far too large for the rest of him. Cooper kept his eyes down, his ears drooped, his body small but brave. Mark looked at that paw, then at the puppy's bowed head. It was not a trick. It was not negotiation. It was the smallest apology Cooper knew how to offer. Cooper kept his oversized paw on Mark Bennett's boot for several quiet seconds, as if the entire fate of Blue Ridge Animal Clinic depended on that tiny apology being properly received. Mark looked down at the black and tan puppy, and for once he did not try to make a joke right away. Cooper's head was lowered, his one upright ear leaning slightly forward, his floppy ear hanging in shame, and his round brown eyes fixed on the floor with the heavy sorrow of a thief whose kingdom had been audited. The metal tray of treasures sat nearby: turkey treats, the gray sock, the chewed shoelace, the blue pen cap, the yellow rubber duck, the blanket strip, and the temporary clinic name tag. They looked absurd under the bright lights, like evidence from the smallest criminal trial in North Carolina. Dr. Susan Miller stood beside the table with her chart in hand, her face soft and amused, while Tammy Wilson leaned against the counter pretending not to be deeply affected by a puppy's paw on a boot. Mark finally bent and scratched gently behind Cooper's uneven ears. "All right," he said, voice low and warm. "Apology accepted." Cooper glanced up, not fully trusting the verdict yet. Mark nodded once, solemn as a judge. "But probation begins immediately." Tammy let out a tiny laugh. "Strict supervision. Limited access to socks." Cooper's tail gave one cautious wag. It was not the proud flag from the waiting room, not yet, but it was movement, and in a room that had held mystery, comedy, exposure, and shame all before lunch, that little wag felt like sunrise. Susan smiled and slid the chart closed. "He did very well, considering." Mark looked at the tray. "Considering he brought a portable evidence locker to his checkup?" "Considering he's a baby," Susan corrected gently. Cooper seemed to hear that. His shoulders loosened. Mark saw it and felt the warmth in his chest deepen. He liked Susan for that. She could laugh without humiliating, correct without scolding, and turn a ridiculous situation into something kinder. Cooper, perhaps sensing that the kingdom had not been destroyed after all, lifted his head. His nose twitched toward the rubber duck. The duck, still wounded from its time in hiding, sat tilted on its side with the tragic dignity of a fallen naval vessel. Cooper nudged it once. It squeaked weakly. Tammy pressed her lips together, eyes shining. "I'm fine," she announced to no one. "Completely fine, just allergic to excessive cuteness." Mark looked at her. "You work at an animal clinic. It's a chronic condition." Susan laughed, then stepped closer to Cooper, holding one hand low and open. "Can we part as friends, young man?" Cooper stared at her hand. Only minutes ago, that same hand had uncovered his secret treasure, exposed his snack bag, and brought down the proud walls of his belly fortress. Now it waited patiently, palm up, asking nothing but trust. Cooper looked at Mark first. Mark understood the look. Permission. Reassurance. "Are we still safe here?" Mark gave a small nod. "Go on." Cooper stood carefully, his paws too large for his legs, his body still carrying the softness of embarrassment. He took one step toward Susan, then another. The room seemed to hold its breath. Tammy stopped moving. Susan stayed perfectly still, her green eyes gentle. Cooper reached her hand, sniffed it once, then lifted his right front paw and placed it delicately in her palm. No tricks, no blocking, no negotiation. Just a soft, warm paw resting there like a little white flag made of fur. Susan's expression changed. The amusement remained, but something tender rose beneath it. "Oh," she whispered. "That's a truce paw." Tammy turned toward the cabinet and waved one hand in front of her face. "Nobody look at me. I am not crying. My allergy is flaring." Mark crouched beside Cooper and rubbed the puppy's neck. "Truce accepted," he said. Cooper's tail wagged once, then twice, stronger now. The little German shepherd lifted his chin. His upright ear stood tall again. The floppy one remained sideways, which somehow made him look brave and ridiculous at the same time. The storm inside him had passed. The treasure was still his. The people were still his, and the world, despite one humiliating investigation, had not taken everything away. Susan gave his paw a gentle squeeze before releasing it. "You're a healthy boy, Cooper. A dramatic one, but healthy." Tammy pointed toward the tray. "Do we send the evidence home with him?" Mark looked at the objects and sighed. "Apparently the court has ordered property returned." Susan placed the safer items into a small paper bag. The treats, the blanket strip, the sock, and the rubber duck. The pen cap, shoelace, and clinic name tag were removed from Cooper's possession with official dignity. Cooper watched the process carefully, but he did not protest. He seemed to understand that some negotiations ended in compromise. Mark lifted him from the table, and Cooper settled into his arms with a tired sigh, his head resting against Mark's shoulder. For a moment, the former Navy SEAL stood there holding a sleepy puppy and a bag of legally questionable treasures, and the whole morning felt like one of those strange little miracles. Ordinary life sometimes dropped at a man's feet. Not the kind with trumpets or lightning. The kind with wet noses, stolen socks, and forgiveness offered through one oversized paw. At the front desk, Tammy printed the invoice while Susan wrote a note on Cooper's chart. Mark shifted the puppy in his arms and pulled out his wallet. Cooper watched everything from his perch, eyes half closed, expression saintly. The waiting room had grown busier. The elderly man with the tabby cat smiled from his chair. The woman with the sleepy beagle leaned over and whispered, "He looks so innocent." Mark glanced down at Cooper. "That's how he gets you." Tammy handed him the receipt. "Next visit, I recommend a pre-entry belly inspection." Susan nodded from the hallway. "And maybe check the carrier too, even if he refuses to ride in it." Mark tucked the receipt away. "Noted. Full customs inspection before crossing the clinic border." Cooper blinked slowly. Angelic and deeply untrustworthy. The rain outside had softened to a mist, silvering the glass door and blurring the pine trees beyond. Mark turned to leave, Cooper tucked comfortably against his chest, the paper bag of approved treasures dangling from one hand. They were almost at the door when Tammy's voice cut through the waiting room. "Wait." Mark stopped. Susan looked up. Tammy stood behind the desk, patting the counter, then the clipboard, then the pocket of her scrub top. Her brow furrowed. "Dr. Miller, where's your blue pen?" Susan touched her lab coat pocket. Empty. She checked the chart. Nothing. Slowly, very slowly, all three adults turned toward Cooper. The puppy sat upright in Mark's arms, gazing through the rainy window with the serene innocence of a stained glass angel. His chest was puffed out. His little harness sat snug around his shoulders. And beneath the front strap, tucked with alarming skill against his soft fur, the end of a blue pen pointed proudly toward freedom. No one spoke. Cooper did not move. Tammy whispered, "No way." Susan stepped closer, her mouth open in disbelief. "Is that my pen?" Mark looked down at Cooper. Cooper looked up at Mark with eyes so pure they could have fooled a jury of grandmothers. Mark closed his eyes, breathed in through his nose, and opened them again. "No," he said at last. "That's evidence now." The waiting room erupted in laughter. Tammy leaned over the desk, nearly helpless. Susan shook her head, smiling despite herself, and gently retrieved the pen from Cooper's harness. Cooper allowed it with the dignity of a spy caught at the border. Then he gave one small wag, as if congratulating everyone for surviving the final test. Mark stepped into the misty morning carrying Cooper and the paper bag of treasures, his boots splashing softly on the wet walkway. Behind him, Blue Ridge Animal Clinic glowed warm in the rain, a little brighter now for having been conquered by a puppy king. And everyone inside understood one thing with absolute certainty. The next time Cooper Bennett came for a checkup, they would need more than a stethoscope. They would need a defensive plan. Sometimes a miracle does not arrive with thunder in the sky. Sometimes it comes with muddy paws, a stolen sock, and a little heart learning that love will not disappear. Cooper's funny adventure reminds us that even in ordinary places, a clinic, a rainy morning, a tired hallway, God can leave small signs of grace. In daily life, we all hide something: fear, shame, old worries, or the need to feel safe. But love has a gentle way of saying, you do not have to guard your heart alone. May this story remind you to laugh more, forgive faster, and notice the tiny blessings walking beside you. If Cooper made you smile, please share this story with someone who needs a little joy today, leave a comment about where you're watching from, and subscribe for more heartwarming stories. May God bless you and your family always.